From Microbe TV, this is a special episode of Immune, an immune booster recorded on July 23rd, 2025. I'm Cindy Leifer, and you're listening to the podcast about the body's defenders against disease. Today, I have an unusual and inspiring story to share. If you like these booster stories on Immune where I share the scientist behind the science, please consider supporting the shows of Microbe TV by going to microbe.tv/contribute. Today I have a story about Dr. Liz Marnik. When I heard her story, I knew I needed to interview her and share this story with you. I met Liz through a group that I blog for called Those Nerdy Girls. I'll put the link in the show notes for Those Nerdy Girls' Substack, where you can find things that Liz and I have written about. But I found Liz and other people who grew up or were against vaccines and had the strength and adaptability to change their viewpoint about vaccines. It's easy for some of us who trust vaccines and herald all the wonderful ways they protect individuals and our society to look down upon people who are vaccine hesitant. But that isn't fair, and sometimes it can be really harmful. Sometimes, like for Liz, there's just a child growing up in a family that was normal to them, and they didn't have or maybe still don't realize that the family values don't align with scientific evidence. Maybe they find out about science and it chips a tiny crack in what they thought was true. It's sometimes a difficult path to develop new value systems, especially if they clash with family. Here is the story of Liz Marnik, who went from unvaccinated child to a career in immunology and science communication, especially around vaccines and infectious disease. Enjoy. I wanted to have this conversation with you because you have a really interesting backstory, because I know now you are involved in science communication in many different areas. You've actually trained as an immunologist, but you grew up in a household that was not a proponent of vaccines, to put it mildly. And so I was really interested to hear your story and potentially what people can learn from that story. Both people who are in favor of vaccines, but may want to learn how you can talk to people and how people do change their minds and what goes behind that. But also just getting that story out there to understand that people are, they can change their mind and it's okay and everything turns out good in the end. So that's why I wanted to have you on. So thank you so much for coming on and talking with me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you grew up unvaccinated.
Yeah.
And now you actually do a lot of science communication around vaccines and other health issues. You did a PhD in immunology. So what was that like? What I'm really interested to know is, when did you realize that you weren't vaccinated?
I think I didn't really consider it at all until I was in college, because it kind of was just the way that I was raised. It didn't seem weird to me. And I was raised very religious, but the church I was in was kind of a mixed population. So some people were vaccinated, some people were not. It wasn't something like the church said we couldn't vaccinate. It wasn't that type of thing. It was just something my mom very much decided to go down the path of. When I was born, I was her first child. So I was kind of entrenched in this mindset of vaccines are harmful. We don't do them. And I remember having conversations as a teenager with people in my church who were vaccinated and thinking, oh, I'm glad I wasn't, because my mom told me that they're so dangerous. Mm. But I never actually stopped to think of why that was what I was being told. And I was homeschooled for a large proportion of my training. So I was also very sheltered from the type of science information I was allowed to learn. So I was taken out of public school because my mother was worried it would corrupt me. And the curriculum that I used for when I was younger was it was a religious curriculum. So I was taught a literal seventh-day creation. I wasn't taught anything about evolution. I don't remember learning anything about the immune system in those years. And I didn't go back to public school until 11th grade. And that's where I finally fell in love with science. I was in a chemistry class and I fell in love with it. They helped me, my teachers in 11th and 12th grade helped me figure out how to apply for college, how to fund college, because I didn't have money to do it on my own and my parents weren't helping me. So they helped me figure all of that out. And then I got into college, and it was in college when I learned about evolution for the first time and where I started learning about the immune system. And I ended up joining a lab as an undergraduate. It was a genetics lab, but we were studying graft versus host disease. So we had a mutation in a mouse line that caused skin tissue rejection. And I fell in love with research. I fell in love with learning about the immune system. And it was at that point in time where I started being like, hey, wait, I'm starting to understand why vaccines exist. And maybe what I was taught was wrong. And I finally did go get vaccinated right before I left for graduate school, because I knew at that point in time I was likely to join an immunology lab. And I knew I couldn't do that and also be unvaccinated. It didn't mesh with what I now knew about the information.
So I have a couple questions. One is, when you first went to that chemistry class and you started learning about all the science, were you frustrated that you weren't allowed to learn that before then?
I don't remember. When I was homeschooled, I remember being very interested in the science that I was allowed to learn. I loved learning about, in the lens of which I was learning about it, I liked learning about, plant growth and that type of stuff. So I remember thinking it was really interesting even through that lens, but I don't remember what I thought. I think at that point in time, I was so glad to be in public school again. I really pushed hard to be let back into public school. My mom didn't want me to, but I was at the point where she didn't care what I was learning anymore. So I was essentially homeschooling myself. Oh. And I knew that that wasn't working, and I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to be able to do more with my life. So I was just really glad to be there and be in that setting. And I don't remember what else was going through my mind.
The other thing that I was thinking about is when you made that choice to actually go get vaccinated, were you scared because you were told that it was wrong and bad and dangerous for your life up until then?
I was nervous, yes, but I think it's also important that I mention that it wasn't just information that helped me change my mind. And I get more into this after, but it was also the relationships I was starting to build with other people outside of that bubble that I grew up in. I grew up pretty isolated. Because I was homeschooled, I didn't really have any friends outside of the church, and I was in this very small community. So college was really my first time ever really making friends with people who didn't believe the same things I believed. And as I started having those conversations, part of my mindset shift was also realizing you can be a good person and believe differently than I was taught. And that really opened the door for me to start questioning kind of everything I had been taught and believed as I was growing up. So by the time it came for me to go get my vaccines, it was winter or spring right before I graduated college. I actually brought somebody with me, and they sat with me because I was a little bit nervous. I was trying to navigate these appointments. I had gone to my PCP who I was seeing, and he was an adult doctor, so he didn't have them. So it was kind of a pain to figure out where could I go to get them as an adult. And it didn't, from what I recall, they didn't have a catch-up schedule at that point in time. So I remember they finally told me to go to the vaccine travel clinic at the local academic hospital. And I remember sitting there for quite a few hours as they were figuring out the best order of vaccines to give me. And it ended up being fine, but I did have that person with me just to kind of be an extra support. And at that point, I didn't really question the information I had learned anymore, because I now knew enough about vaccination and the immune system to understand why it was important. But it was still that little thought in the back of your head was what if I have an allergic reaction, or what if something weird happens? So it was nice to have a person with me for that.
Can you say a little bit more about some of those conversations that you had? You said it wasn't just, learning more about vaccines during your education, but that some of the conversations shaped how you started to think about vaccines.
Yeah, I think for me, it was a combination of things. It really was not just vaccines in general, but more so like the framework of which I was thinking about my belief system and my relationship with science in general. So I remember having conversations with friends who I knew their parents loved them because I was welcomed into their home. I had dinners with them at the table. And then for some reason, vaccines came up. I think we were learning about them in one of our classes. And I remember like sharing, oh, my mom didn't vaccinate me. And that surprised everyone at that point in time. It was a little bit maybe less of a table conversation than it is perhaps now. But it really was that reaction and then that conversation that came from that was like learning about like, well, the reason they decided to vaccinate their children, even though my mom didn't vaccinate me for very similar reasons, right? At the end of the day, my mom thought she was making a decision to protect me. And they were making a decision to protect their own kids. And it was really starting to realize that ultimately there are some of those common principles, but sometimes the decision is made based on false information. And I ended up, the more I started digging, I started eventually having more conversations with my mother about why she made that decision. Mm-hmm. And I started seeing that it likely was based on a lot of false information. And that kind of also helped me to start to like reckon with a lot of the information that I had been taught.
The reckoning too, where you're like, okay, my mom wanted to protect me, but yet she was doing the opposite of that based on my knowledge. Had to be hard to have those conversations. What was that like?
I'll be honest, I was angry at her for a very, very, very long time. And it wasn't until I had my own kids that I understood it. So I will be honest, I did not tell my mom I got vaccinated until about a year after I got my vaccines for the first time. We already were not in a good place at that point in time. She didn't want me going to grad school. She didn't want me moving away. So I just didn't want to add another thing to that because it was already a very strained time for our relationship. And I was just very angry because I was starting to like think about all the things. My life growing up was very challenging for also other reasons. And I was a little bit angry for those reasons. And it was just not a great situation. So I spent a lot of time just kind of angry at her for that decision. And it wasn't until I had my own son. He was my first. I have two, and he is now 6. But I remember they put him in my arms in the hospital room after I almost died giving birth because I hemorrhaged. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, I have to keep this child alive. And he had some potential health complications, and it was just very anxiety provoking for me. Mm-hmm. And I remember questioning everything that I was doing just because it was this period of intense emotional stress and anxiety and hormones and all of those things. And it was really that experience that made me realize why parents and mothers particularly are so susceptible to false information, particularly at that moment of time, because it is really a hard period of transition to navigate. And when I finally then started having conversations with my mom as a mother myself, I had a lot more compassion for her and for how a lot of that probably transpired. And I did get to have more conversations with her. And she shared with me that I was her first, and she's very anxious as a person in general. And she went to her doctor after somebody had given her a book about something that they said was caused by vaccines. I don't even remember what the book's name was. She couldn't remember it. But she brought some of these questions to the doctor, the pediatrician that she was bringing me to, and he told her, you vaccinate your kid because I told you to. And he wouldn't take the time to answer her question.
Wow.
So she was like, okay, that doesn't sit well with me. I'm really scared. So she decided to leave and did not vaccinate me. We were then thrown out of the practice, and I didn't go back to a doctor until I was a teenager.
Wow.
Like, we just never went back. And it was really obviously that was a pretty pivotal moment for her, but also it really gave me compassion for like how different could that conversation have gone if somebody had taken time to just be like, oh, I understand, like it's really hard becoming a new mom. Let me try to answer your questions. But that wasn't what happened. And it was in the 80s. So the mindset was different then. And also I think sometimes you just get a bad doctor who isn't willing to have those conversations, right? There was a lot of
bad bedside manner.
A lot of unfortunate things that transpired there. But overall, I think that really gave me compassion and helps me now as I communicate. A lot of my followers are mothers. I am also a mother. I understand how hard it is to navigate those things. And that really is a lens by which I now try to communicate.
And that's it. I think that's a repeating thing that happens with people where if they feel heard, they're more receptive to hearing the information that you have to share. Mm-hmm. And if that conversation is shut down and there isn't that connection and feeling like you're being heard and your concerns are validated, they may not agree with your concerns, but they could at least conceptually see how you could have them.
Yeah.
Then it really interferes with the ability to have these conversations. And I think that brings us a little bit to some of your science communication. And you sort of said that underlies a lot of what you do. I often think about, well, what if you don't have that shared experience? It's easy for you to say, for example, when they put the baby in your arms and you're like, I get it now. And it seems like for a lot of things in science and otherwise that people can have these opinions until it hits them directly. And then they're like, oh, now I get it. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's a really difficult thing to try and navigate. And so I want to step back and say, how did you get into science communication? Well, yeah. How did you get into science communication? But also, how did you get into immunology? Because that's going like way out on the limb there. So let's start there first. Like you started to learn about immunology and, you were realizing that you didn't get vaccinated and you were having these conversations with these people at the dinner table. Then how did you decide to say, okay, I'm going to go study that? What were some of the things that happened? You said you had a lab experience, but that wasn't in immunology. So how'd you end up doing a PhD in immunology?
Yeah. So I had really great professors. And as I mentioned, I joined one of their labs and we were more so focused on trying to understand the mutation that was causing graft versus host disease. But it led me down kind of a pathway of exploring some of the literature on like graft versus host disease in general, which we know has, immunological components.
That's true. Yes.
And it really just opened my eyes to the type of research that was possible. But when I entered grad school, I actually wasn't 100% sure. I knew it was possible I would end up in an immunology lab, but I ended up in an umbrella program. Mm-hmm. So I was at the Tufts University School of Medicine, their graduate program, and they had a graduate program in genetics. And in genetics, you could use genetics as a tool to study a whole different thing, a whole host of different things. So I had friends who were in immunology labs, friends who were in neurology labs, cell bio labs, cancer labs. There was like a whole range of labs I could join. And so I went in thinking I wanted to probably end up in an immunology lab, but I did try out different labs to see. And I ultimately decided that I really liked the immunology lab. I also had, as a teenager, the reason I finally went back to a doctor was because I started having some joint pain and swelling and things like that. And I had psoriasis is what I ended up finding out it was, with potentially some like psoriatic arthritis underpinnings. So that kind of got me interested in immunology from that autoimmune perspective. And I ended up joining an autoimmune lab. So my work focused, I rotated in the lab, and his work was really focused on kind of two areas. He had two different projects, one on IgG antibodies and placental transfer of those antibodies. So that was one of the projects he had. But then he also had autoimmune projects focused on understanding the role of follicular T helper cells and germinal center B cells. And I joined the lab working on that. specific project. So my work really focused on understanding the normal process by which CD4 T cells differentiate into TFH, the T follicular helper cells, and then how that process was altered in mouse models of autoimmune disease.
And those helper cells are important because we always say they help B cells to make antibodies. And those antibodies, a lot of people are familiar with them because they help protect against viral infections and things. They're induced by vaccines, but they can also be, and generally they target foreign things, but they can target self things. And that's when you get autoimmune disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So do you feel like you didn't work in a psoriasis lab though. So you weren't trying to understand your own disease. Some people do that.
No, my work was focused primarily on lupus, and a little bit we had a mouse model of rheumatoid arthritis so I took some of my findings and looked to see if they also applied to other autoimmune models.
Mm-hmm. Did you feel at all like you were kind of trying to understand your own biology in pursuing immunology?
Yeah, a little bit like that. And autoimmune diseases run in my family. So it was kind of, I think, also that, like, I have an aunt who has lupus. And so there was that also connection of thinking it was really interesting to kind of try to understand more about things that I personally had experience in. And then I kind of just fell in love with it as I was in that lab. It was just fascinating. Yeah, it was so fun. And I was really glad to have that opportunity.
And when people train in this, so you go to college, you started working in a research lab, and then you went to graduate school, and people can take many different tracks after graduate school, and you actually continued down a track that we call the academic path. So can you say a little bit more about, what were those steps, and how did you get to where you are now, and tell us about your position now?
Yeah, so I loved the bench research that I was doing as a grad student, but I pretty quickly realized I didn't want to be the kind of head of a lab that I was seeing at the institution I was at. So I did my PhD through Tufts University, but I did all of my work at the Jackson Laboratory, where they have, some people know them because they produce mice to be used by researchers across the world. But also they have their own researchers at their own institutions who study a variety of things. So I was in the best place to do mouse research because I could go down the hall and essentially get any mouse I wanted because they were producing so many, which was great. But the PIs there didn't teach. They pretty much only wrote grants because it wasn't at an academic institution. So they were in their lab all the time writing grants, very rarely doing anything else. And I didn't want that job because I found out pretty quickly that wasn't what excited me the most about what I was doing. I really loved teaching and explaining what I was doing to other people, and I liked the hands-on part too, but it was really the writing about it and then explaining it part that most excited me. So I struggled really hard as I finished my PhD because I had postdoc offers for a few places in different parts of the country in immunology labs, which would have took me down more of the research track. But I also didn't know if I wanted to do that. So I really had a lot of intense debate internally about what I wanted to do. And I ultimately decided that I really wanted to pursue more of the educational aspect of science. So I realized I needed to switch my model organism because I had only ever worked with mice. I did all of my undergrad work with mice. I did all of my PhD work with mice. So I had about 11 years of mouse research experience by that point in time. But mice are not great for educational purposes for most places. I knew that I probably would end up working potentially at a school that was mostly teaching focused or doing more education than doing bench research. So I wanted to switch my model organism. So I ended up completely switching, and I ended up switching my research to C. elegans, which are, for people who are not aware, they're like microscopic, like smaller than the tip of my, like the two little space between my fingernails. They're a type of nematode roundworm that you can find in dirt, but they do have a surprising amount of similarity to humans. Now, they don't have an adaptive immune system at all, which is very different. And that was a hard decision for me to make.
And the adaptive immune system you're talking about are T cells that you were studying before, and B cells, and making antibodies. So they don't have these T cells that can directly kill infected cells, and they don't have B cells make antibodies, but they still have a rudimentary immune system, right?
Yeah, so they have, because they still have to worry about pathogens. A lot of what they worry about are things like bacteria that they get exposed to in their environment. So I actually was doing work on it's a very niche word called germ granules. So I will explain what that means. So in certain types of cells, there are these clusters, these like combination of RNA and proteins that sit on top of the nucleus. So nucleus is where your DNA is, and your DNA has the directions to make everything that your body needs to survive. And we have DNA, and so do these worms. And our DNA and their DNA is in this room, the nucleus. And the directions are on the DNA, but the protein that is actually made, that makes our skin and our hair and our immune cells, that is made in the cytoplasm, a different part of the cell. So to get those directions from the nucleus to the cytoplasm, you have to go through what's called the nuclear pore complex, a little doorway in the nucleus. And in certain cells, this doorway is blocked by these granules. So there's these little clusters, and they act as filters. And one of the things that they're doing is they're checking every RNA that gets through to make sure it's actually supposed to be allowed into that cell. And one of the really important parts of what that germ granule do is something called making small RNAs. So these are tiny little microscopic RNAs. And this is actually a big part of a worm's immune system. It's how a worm remembers and passes down memory for bacteria it's been exposed to in the past. So if it's been exposed to a certain bacteria, it will make these little tiny RNA molecules that can help destroy that bacteria. And then it will pass those down to its offspring to help protect them. So I was kind of still studying immunology in a very different way. I was studying how these germ granules were functioning and how that process was happening. And that's what I did for my postdoc.
I think that's fascinating. And that brings to my mind the thought of how bacteria defend themselves also is very similar. So people may have heard of CRISPR, and CRISPR is, it's basically little sequences that it takes from the viruses that infect the bacteria, and it plops it into a part of the genome so it can make these anti-RNAs, so it can degrade those RNAs. So it's the same kind of idea. That's really interesting. Then what did you do after that? Because you still, the general path in academia is you go to undergrad, grad, postdoc, and then to a position like a professorship position at usually a university or something like that.
Yeah. So I did do that. So I started applying for jobs at the end of my postdoc. My postdoc was funded I got an NIH grant to fund my postdoctoral work. And I was approaching the end of that grant. So I was I could have stayed longer, but I didn't need to necessarily stay longer. So I started applying for jobs. And that was exactly when COVID-19 happened, because it was the winter of 2020. So I did get an offer, though. My husband and I, we had our first son at that point in time. And we really wanted to stay in Maine if we could, because we have family here. We love the hiking and all of the things about living in this area we really liked. So our first goal was, if I could find a job locally, we would stay. If not, we would then explore. I would stay in my postdoc position for longer, and we would explore moving to different parts of the country. But I was lucky enough to get a faculty offer for a small private institution in Maine. It was about an hour from where I did my postdoc. And it was a great opportunity. I was going to be teaching in their merged science department. So they were you can kind of think of them as like a primarily undergraduate institution. So they do have graduate degrees in nursing and in pharmacy. So I was seeing some of those pre-nursing, pre-pharmacy students, but most of the students that I was seeing are students who just were getting 4-year degrees in biology or in forensics or in something like that. So it was a heavily teaching focused position. Most of my job was teaching. I did still do some research, and I incorporated my undergraduates into that research. And I taught a variety, because we were a small merged science department. I kind of taught everything. So I taught general chemistry at one point. I taught microbiology for almost every year I was there. I taught immunology. I taught molecular biology. I taught general biology. So I taught a lot of different things. My favorite was microbiology and immunology for obvious reasons. But it was a good experience. But during all of that period of time, I was also communicating science to the public because I started that in, I think, April of 2020 because of COVID-19. I was in that environment where a lot of my friends and family on Facebook were spreading misinformation about COVID-19 because I was raised in that mindset. My mother was very anti-vaxx still at that point in time, still today, but I've made headway. And I felt a responsibility to try to address the things I was seeing, particularly because I was worried about the safety of my friends and family who were sharing this information. So I started addressing it, and the post started being shared. And then I started feeling like maybe I don't want this shared from my personal Facebook page because it was literally just like my personal Facebook. So that is what started me developing Science Whiz Liz, which is my Instagram account, which is where I have my most followers. And I'm trying to diversify into other platforms right now. But through all of my faculty position, I was teaching full time, parenting, and then also doing all of that science communication work on the side. And I started realizing pretty quickly that while I love teaching, I felt like I wasn't quite making the difference that I felt I could make in other settings. And what I mean by that is I loved my students, and I still actually talk to quite a few of them. They still message me updates about their life. Some of them are in grad school and med school and vet school now. But by the time I was seeing them, they already were pretty convinced that they wanted to do something in science. I did teach a non-majors biology class, which I also really loved, but most of my students were pre-pharmacy, pre-nursing, biology, wanting to go to med school. They were in that area. And it was great, but I felt like I needed to get them when they weren't sure what they wanted to do, or when they weren't sure about science or their potential place in it. So I started looking for jobs outside of my position. And I was lucky enough that my postdoctoral institution where I did my postdoc heard I was on the job market and asked if I wanted to go back there. And now I am their director of science education and outreach. And what that means is that my work is really focused on reaching K through 12 students in rural Maine and showing them how cool and exciting science is. But then also I do work with undergraduates still, and with graduate students still, and with the public, trying to help the public understand, well, why is it that science is important? And why is it the work that the lab does? Why is that work important in general, and also to the people directly that I'm talking to? And I still get to do some research. So I now collaborate with my postdoctoral mentor, and we sometimes incorporate real research into our education courses. So I brought real research experiments into an 8th grade classroom, and the students got to help collect real data that might one day make it into a research paper, which is cool. And I now do education research. So I have studies ongoing to see if the educational programs that I'm developing are actually helping to teach things to students, but also change their perception of science and their place in it.
That last piece is really interesting because it just kind of like solidifies that you're still a researcher at heart, and you always want to like investigate things. And it's really interesting that you're putting it into the context of, what I am doing actually having an impact, and how does one measure that, and how does one figure that out? I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a hard question. And it's something that I think we are all trying to kind of figure out, particularly the thing I'm really interested in that I haven't yet figured out how to design a good study for is if this online science communication that we're all doing, like how can we better quantify and measure that impact? That's harder. But a lot of what I'm doing, so for example, as a postdoc, I developed a week-long course for high school students. And I've been able to, even when I left the lab to go to my university position, I actually came back every summer to teach this class for the lab. And it's a week-long course for high school students. And it just immerses them in biomedical research. They get to work, they design their own experiments with C. elegans. They get to do CRISPR in bacteria or in worms, depending on the year. And they get to meet the researchers at the lab. They get to hear about different career options in science. So I now have a study on that course where I'm looking at overall like learning outcomes. So are they actually learning the things I want them to learn? So I'm asking them questions about content. But I'm also doing something called a pre and a post test. But the way that it's done is actually, so at the end of the week-long experience, I give them a survey if they consent to be in the study. And in that survey, I ask them to reflect back to when they first started the course a week ago. And I ask them to rank, well, how were you when you started on these topics? And then how are you now that you've gone through the course? And the questions I'm asking are like, I could pull up the study. I don't remember them exactly now, but they're questions related to, do you understand the importance of basic research now? Or do you see yourself as potentially going into a science career? And so those types of questions. And then we're measuring whether or not that has changed. And then I send them a 6-month follow-up survey.
Oh, that's good.
So then again, see if they've had if they've still retained the things that I taught them, and how their perceptions or views of their place in science has maintained or decreased or increased over time. And then there's places where they can, I leave open-ended to get more qualitative data about their thoughts and their relationship with the information that they learned and that type of thing.
What's the most interesting comments that you've gotten from those?
So I recently taught the class like a month ago, and a student said that so I don't often share my background in these classes because there's just not tons of time, and it can sometimes, I always struggle with how much of my personal background do I relate to people when I'm like in a position of authority over them. But a few of them actually Googled me. so in one of the comments, somebody told me that they came from a family that also didn't really think about science much, and that it meant a lot to them to see that, like, where I was and know that they weren't alone and could get to a place like I was in the future, which was really, really exciting. And then I always get a lot of comments related to thinking about, some of these students thought they wanted to do careers in medicine, but then after having gone through this experience, they were like, oh, I never thought that a research career could be particularly for me.
Yep.
And they now are like, I really now want to consider maybe doing a PhD, maybe doing an MD PhD, but really thinking about how they could potentially incorporate research into their future careers, which is cool too.
You know, I think that's a really important point. I certainly, when I was in college, I thought it was medicine. Like, I didn't know what research was, but I thought, oh, I need to go into a research lab so I can get a letter, because everybody thinks that, right? But then when I got in the research lab, I'm like, wow, I could do this for a living. I get to play in the lab and learn things and like learn new things and then teach them to other people. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And I was like, this is what I want to do. So yeah, I think that's so interesting. And I worry, as I'm sure you do, that taking away some of those opportunities is going to take, like people in rural Maine, like you're working with, they wouldn't have an opportunity to have that experience in any other place. And so if we don't keep like pushing to make sure that we have those opportunities available for those students, it's just going to limit who even thinks about that as a possible option. And just having those different minds with different ways of thinking and different life experiences just makes science so much more rich. And I worry about the direction that things might go if we pull back on that.
I do too. And it's ultimately, I would not be where I am today if it wasn't for my chemistry and biology teacher in high school.
Yeah.
Because I never, like, growing up, part of my culture, like the way in which I was entrenched was that you were supposed to get married and have babies, and that was it. I wasn't supposed to have a career outside of that. That was what I was supposed to do. And until I got into that chemistry class, I never really thought much about like, oh, a career in science could actually be for me. So it was really transformative for me to have a teacher be like, oh, you're good at this. I remember like getting so obsessed over stoichiometry, which is like this really obscure math thing that you use in chemistry to do like chemical reactions. But I just thought it was like the coolest thing ever. And it was so much fun. And I remember the chemistry teacher being like, you know, you're really good at this. Have you thought about going to college for science? And I remember being like, no, I did not. And I actually entered college as a chemistry major and switched because I pretty quickly realized I liked science, but I liked science that relates to living things.
Yep. Sounds very familiar to me. Yeah. I had exactly the same experience. Yeah. You know, as you were talking about your research over time, one of the things that you talked about was that you were funded by the NIH for your postdoctoral work. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really interesting because if we go back and remember what you said, you were working on these little microscopic worms that are obviously not people. And we don't often hear about why research like that is important to do. And I know you were recently down in DC, kind of, you know, helping to make people aware of the importance of NIH research. And I just wondered if there was anything you kind of wanted to say about that based on, you know, your work was funded by the NIH. Why, you know, in the public, why should they care about these little worms? And in general, sort of what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. So when I'm explaining this to people, I kind of like to think about it as building a house. So basic research, which is research, we use that term to explain research that's done kind of far away from humans, it seems like. So it might be with worms or it might be with flies, but it's studying a specific process in that organism. And that is important because if you think about building a house, you have to have a really good foundation before you can start putting the walls and the roof on. And that foundation in science comes from basic research because we can't figure out how to fix somebody's autoimmune disease or better treat somebody's autoimmune disease if we don't first understand how the immune system works in the first place. Or if we're studying something in the nervous system and we're studying neurons, if we don't understand how neurons talk to each other, we're not going to be able to try to figure out ways of helping a human who has a potential disease where the neurons don't communicate well. So we really get that fundamental understanding from all of that basic research to build that foundation. Because even though a worm and a fly look really different than us, there's actually a lot of similarities between all of these living organisms, and we can use those similarities to learn about how neurons talk. And we can study neurons in a fly, and it's very similar to the way a neuron would communicate in a human. And with worms, we focus on the things that are shared, like those germ granules I talked about. We have them too, and they function very similarly. And the proteins I studied that were inside of those granules are the same as proteins we have ourselves. So it's harder to study in a human for lots of reasons, ethical reasons, technical reasons. But by studying and getting that foundation in other organisms, we eventually can take it to building walls and eventually maybe developing treatments and cures for things because we've learned how to get to that point.
I love that description that you just gave. I also wanted to circle back a little bit, that when you talked about talking with your mom about vaccines and her beliefs and your education and your beliefs and getting vaccinated. And you made an offhanded comment. You're like, I've made some headway with my mom. And I was wondering if you could say more. So what was it like before? You said it was a strained relationship. You waited a year to tell her about getting vaccinated. So where was it? Where is it? And what changed? Because I think that's an important piece that people could take away on how to communicate in these situations.
Yeah. So I would say one of the things that frustrates me the most now as a communicator is oftentimes I kind of feel my role is, one, to try to reach people, but also two, try to equip people who already have this scientific information or trust science to also then have these conversations with people. So a lot of times I will post something about approaching conversations with empathy and curiosity, and I get a lot of pushback because people are like, oh, it didn't work. I tried that and it didn't work. And what I think people don't realize is how long this takes sometimes. So I moved to Maine and started my PhD about 14 years ago. So this has been really a 14-year journey with my mother. And it went from being a point where I didn't talk to her about vaccines at all, to eventually I brought up the conversation about me getting vaccinated. She was not happy, but it was done and I was fine. So at that point she was like, okay. But then I had a baby and she was like, oh, you're not going to vaccinate your baby, right? And I'm like, no, I am vaccinating my baby because I've studied the immune system. I understand why this is important. And so I brought in those things as I was having that conversation. And then I kind of let it drop. And then I had my second baby because I have 2 kids. And again, she was like, oh, are you going to vaccinate her? And in between there, I actually had my son in a COVID-19 trial. She was not happy about that either, but I explained to her why I was doing it and all of those things. So it was a lot of conversations throughout these 14 years. And it's only in the last, I would say, year and a half that I've started to really see some glimpses of progress. For example, we had a conversation related to measles because measles is on the news a lot right now. And we have the most cases recorded on record in the last
30 years.
So we talked about measles and I brought up immune amnesia. So we now know that one of the crazy things about measles is it erases some of your prior immune memory. Normally, after you've been exposed to a pathogen, your immune system will remember that pathogen and that helps protect you the next time or reduces severity the next time. But measles actually erases some of that memory. And my mom had never heard that before. So she was like, whoa. And then she made a comment. She was like, wow. She's like, I can understand why a vaccine would be really valuable there.
That must have been like, what went through your mind when you heard that?
I was like, oh my God. And then I texted my best friend who has been with me for all of this journey. We've been best friends since college. And I was like, can you believe what my mother just told me? I try not to react like anything crazy in the middle of the conversation. I think I said, yes, exactly. This is why I vaccinated Addie and Owen for MMR. And this is why it's so important and why I talk about this all the time. And then I kind of let it drop because I didn't want to react too much and then
scare her off.
Yeah, exactly. But it was a really big moment because up until that point, I had never heard her say anything positive about a vaccine in my life. And again, that might seem really small to some people, and it is, but it is still a really big step of progress for her. But it took 14 years to get to that point. And that is something where I think not everyone has the ability or the patience to do all of this, but I do like to tell people that anytime you can plant a positive seed, we don't know what will happen to that seed, but in the future it could make a difference. And I have had hundreds of people message me or email me or reach out to me in different ways who have told me that something that I posted 3 years ago eventually helped convince them to go get their kid vaccinated.
Wow.
And it wasn't just me. It was also a lot of us working in this space, a lot of us communicating science online. But in all of those conversations, there's that common theme that 1, we didn't make them feel stupid. 2, we communicated in a way that they could understand. So we didn't use a bunch of technical words. We were talking in language they could understand. But then also they just had the time to sit with that information and then use it. But a big one definitely was also leading with empathy and curiosity. If somebody feels stupid, they're not going to engage with that information. And that was kind of an overarching theme I've also learned in my conversations with my mom. Because we would be having, when I was arguing with her when I was younger, we would have conversations where she would be like, I'm not stupid. You're telling me I'm stupid. And I probably was, because I was in my 20s and I was very angry at that point in time. So I probably did say that. I don't remember, but I've evolved a lot since then. And I now understand better why she made the decision she did, even though it's one that I don't agree with now. And I made a very different decision for my own kids.
I think it's also interesting that you said, this idea of not making someone feel stupid and your mom saying, I'm not stupid. I think part of that is scientists speak a different language. And it can be hard when you're, like, for example, 30, 35 years into a career of studying one specific molecule or pathway. And now you're coming back and realizing, where was I before I even went to graduate school? Like, what knowledge did I know? What knowledge did I not know? How much have I incorporated jargon into my everyday existence, using words that other people use to mean different things? And you can start to realize how, if you just talk to a person about what you do, it can be very intimidating and make them feel stupid, even though that's not your goal. And I'm interested because I think that you've also been doing one other thing, and that is sort of storytelling in a public way to communicate, again, the fun and excitement and passion and curiosity of science. And can you just say a little bit about what you do there and how you think that's making a difference?
Yeah. So as part of the evolution that has happened is I've started to realize more and more, right, that it's not facts that change minds. And I think that's been really hard for me as a scientist, because I am somebody now who relies so much on data for decision making. So for me, I'm like, yeah, this is what the data says. Of course, it's what I'm going to do. But it's not what most people resonate with. So I have really started to try to shift into this storytelling, because there's a lot of data out there in the social sciences and psychology that stories are really great tools to disseminate information. And for me, the way I now balance these things is, if I'm sharing a story, I want it to still be grounded in data. So I'm not going to share a story that contradicts the collective data that we have available. But I still can use stories to illustrate the information and illustrate the data and illustrate that impact. And to take this one step further, I've been trying to figure out ways of bringing these types of stories into community. I think online is a great space to have conversations, and I do feel passionately about scientists showing up online, because otherwise it's where misinformation is, so we need to be there too. But I don't think that's the only place we should be, because I think if we really want to break out of echo chambers and reach people who might not see our social media, we have to be in community with them.
Yes.
Which is hard. So that's why I recently piloted an event that we called Taproom Tales. And it was a partnership between my day job, my personal science communication work, and also a local brewery. And my impetus for this is I really wanted to bring together community members, some of whom are scientists, some of whom are, anybody in any career, to tell stories about how science has been involved or has impacted their life in some way. And the stories are short, anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes. But we piloted the event in June, and we had 6 different storytellers who shared a variety of different stories. And it was at a brewery. It was packed. We are going to be doing it again on August 20th. Because it was such a hit the first time. And we have some storytellers. This time we actually have very few scientists, which I'm excited about. The first storytelling event it took a lot for me to get anyone who wasn't a scientist to say yes, because they had a hard time thinking about how they could frame a story. I now have examples for them, and I've gotten a lot more community members who are willing to talk about it. And the point of this is that at the end of the day, science is involved in pretty much every facet of our life in some way.
Yes.
If we take Advil, thanks to science. If we're using a phone, science. If we're driving a car, science. There's so many ways that science shows up in our life, but oftentimes in ways that are invisible to people. They don't realize that that is what science has brought them. So the purpose of these stories are really to help illustrate ways that science is impacting an everyday person's life. So it's not a data talk. It's not a research talk. It's really about like the small moments in the ways that which science shows up in people's lives. And I do have a resource, if you want to share it with people, I have a resource guide.
Yeah, sure.
I'm hoping people will replicate it in other parts of the country. I already have a friend who's going to be doing it in a different part of Maine, and some people who want to do it in California and other places. So I think it will be fun. And it was just a really fun night to get together. And I had a couple people come up to me afterwards and told me that they didn't come to the event. They just happened to be at the bar getting beer, and they stayed because they thought it was cool to hear the stories. And it's those kinds of things that I wanted to happen, because ultimately somebody might not be following me, or they might not buy tickets to a science event, or they might not turn on a science podcast. But if they're at a beer, or if they're at a bar drinking a beer and there happens to be some stories about science, then they might be more likely to hear them. And we're also working to partner with our local radio station to get some of these. We're recording all of the stories and are working to then eventually get them online, not online, but on the radio with like a community show for an hour.
That's really great. Yeah. Congratulations on that. That sounds great.
It was fun.
Yeah. Anything that we haven't talked about of your experiences, or any of the things that you do that you want to comment on?
I think the only thing I would like to kind of hit home for people is that if there's people in your life that think differently than you do about science, which is probably true for most of us, that the way in which I have found to make the most headway, and I kind of have referred to this, but I would like to emphasize it more, is I often start these conversations from empathy and curiosity. So if somebody tells me that they're worried about vaccinating their kid, I don't immediately say, why would you do that? The data shows it's safe. Because that can kind of put up a wall. Instead, oftentimes I'm like, oh, I get it's hard being a parent right now. Can you tell me what you're worried about? Or can you tell me why you're worried? Or can you tell me what have you heard? And I ask a lot of questions because that helps me start to see what's going on behind in their head, and how can I present or give them information that might be in a way that is usable for them. So a lot of times if I'm talking to a mother or a parent, that's a really big part of their identity, but also a big part of my identity. So I can connect with them on that level and frame the information that I'm giving them through that lens of information. And I have found that's where I make the biggest headway, is really trying to affirm somebody's identity. So I might be like, I understand you're a mom who's trying to make the best decision for your kid. And it's hard to know what to do sometimes because there's a lot. And some people listening right now might be like, no, it's not. It's not hard to know what to do. And the thing I like to remind people is that's a privilege, because it actually is really hard right now. Because misinformation, false information, whatever you want to call it, it is packaged in ways that is really hard for people to understand is not true. And not everyone has access to a library, or not everyone has access to a scientific paper. Not everyone has access to a doctor who will answer their questions. So it's actually not a default assumption to assume the information is out there and easily understandable to everybody. And I have to sometimes remind myself of that too, because otherwise it is easy to dismiss people. And if you dismiss people, then you often might push them in that direction you don't want them to go, which is what ultimately happened with my mother.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think a lot of scientists are hesitant to engage in the conversation because they don't want to make it worse. And they don't feel sometimes that they're equipped with those skills to do what you just said. Because I have the sneaking suspicion that for most scientists who've been trained in data and critical thinking, empathy is not the first descriptor word that you'd have about them. So I think having that language and giving that example of how can I find some shared belief that you could connect with. And I think that the thing I would add to what you said is also don't come in with an agenda. Like if your goal is, I'm going to make sure that they go change their mind, that pretty much inevitably will not work.
Yeah.
Because they will feel that. They somehow will be able to sense, their spidey sense will stick up and say, hey, wait, this person's trying to change my mind. I'm going to dig my heels in. Whereas if you just approach it, like you said, with, I can totally see how that happens. And, I'm here to protect my kids too. I want the best for them. We disagree with what that might be. And, let me tell you how I made my decisions. Not here's how you should do yours, but here's my own experience and my own story. Coming back to that story of why you chose to do what you did, and then leave it. Just leave it in the room, like you did with your mom. Just leave it hang in the room and just plant that seed or just have that little thought and wait for that to percolate. And it may or may not happen. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes it's going to fail.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because that's the framework in which I enter conversations is I'm not seeking, like, if I help change someone's mind, amazing. That will be affirmed. But oftentimes I'm really just seeking a moment of connection with them in the hopes of planting that seed because at least then I've tried.
Yeah.
And it's hard because most of us want to help people make decisions because we understand, right? As scientists, we understand the risks. We understand the things that are at risk. So it's a really hard place to navigate. And it's also something where I think we need to be better at training our scientists to have conversations with the public because it isn't typically a part of our scientific training process. And that's something I'm also doing in my job and piloting a study to see if we can actually improve. So I think there's a lot of ways we can tackle this going forward, but we have to be willing to at least try.
Yeah. I think we share the passion for that too, because I do some education for students around science communication, and I'd like to expand that further and also help my colleagues who are researchers, help them frame what they're doing in a way that they can communicate it to the public and help them do that. So yeah, I think, we always think about like you can do the research yourself or you can train people to do the research. Like you said, you can train people to go out and communicate and, spread it. I always think about how can you make it bigger than just what you can do yourself. And so thinking about ways in your everyday conversations when you're talking with somebody who may be on your side. Like a lot of us preach to the choir, right? We're out there communicating our science and we're like, why do we even bother? Because these people are already on our side. We bother because we can equip them with information and then they can be the connector that to help to get that across. So yeah, I still think it's entirely worthwhile.
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of data out there now too, that there's something called like the psychological distance. So it's like, there's been some work showing that there's a really big gap or psychological distance between the public and science right now. So the public don't quite understand why science is important for them or who scientists are. There's a lot of things going on there. But these things that we do, like having a Taproom Tales event in your community, having conversations with community members, going to schools and libraries and doing science, those things can help reduce that gap. And that ultimately will help all of our messages be understood better because people will then have a shorter distance between their relationship with science. So the things that we can do to bring them closer to understanding why science is important, regardless of what your job is, the better we all will be going forward.
Perfectly well said. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to me. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot.
Great. This was fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and sharing your story, very personal story of your experience. And I know I'm trying to talk to a couple of different people who also were sort of either grew up this way or were not in supportive of vaccines and now have changed and sort of see these different perspectives and these stories and put them out there. So I really appreciate you sharing your story.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very special episode of Immune, an immune booster, a story about anti-vaxx to pro-vaxx. I'm planning a few more of these conversations and hope to shed light on the challenges people face when they make a major shift like that. We would love to have your questions and comments, and reach out if you too were once vaccine hesitant. I want to hear from you. You can send those questions or comments to immune@microbe.tv. Again, consider supporting the shows of Microbe TV, including Immune and these immune booster interviews that I do, by going to microbe.tv/contribute. Remember, Microbe TV is a 501c3, so all of your contributions are tax deductible, and they help us continue to produce this content for you. I'm Cindy Leifer at Cornell University, and you can find me at Cindy Leifer on Blue Sky. I'm really thankful for my guest Liz Marnik, who also goes by Science Whiz Liz on Substack and Instagram. She can also be found at www.elizabethmarnikphd.com. Music on Immune is by Tatami. Thanks for listening to Immune, the podcast that's infectious.